Hello, everyone. We will begin this webinar session in a few minutes. I just want to let you know, everyone that's joining us through our webinar, that this is going to be broadcasted live through our Facebook and YouTube channels. I would also like to remind all participants that this session is being recorded. We will also have access to translation services to Spanish in our Zoom session. If you want to access these services, you can access at the bottom right of your screen. You will see an icon that resembles a globe. So click on this icon and select the language into you would like the session to be translated. We will also be interacting through the chats in a series of questions through a platform called Slido. This platform will show questions where you can have answer through the text box. So we encourage you to participate and answering those questions in the platform. Also, this session is being broadcasted only in English through the channels that we are going also to share through the chat. So you can see there are Facebook and YouTube channels. In the meantime, we're gonna give a few minutes and we will begin shortly. Thank you very much. Welcome, everyone. We are now live. We would like to remind all participants that this session is being recorded. For those just joining us now, we would like to remind you that we have access to translation from Zoom during our event. You can click on the bottom right of your screen, you will see an icon that resembles a globe. You can utilize this icon if you would like translation to Spanish. Our interpreter will provide real-time translation in the language of your choice. The live feed will only be available in English. I would like to welcome everyone, regardless of the time zone you find yourselves in, whether it's early morning or the evening. And thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you for joining us for this third webinar of the series of 3 of key drivers of change that affect livestock systems and their impact on sustainability and resilience, organized by the Global Agenda for Sustainable Livestock, GASL, a multi-stakeholder partnership recognized for facilitating dialogue, sharing good practices and policies, and promoting the sustainability of the global livestock sector, with the support of the Tropical Agricultural Research and Higher Education Center, hereinafter CATIE, an academic center for innovation and sustainable development in topics related to agriculture, management, conservation, and sustainable use of natural resources. This year, CATIE celebrates its 50th anniversary as an institution dedicated to inclusive green development in Latin America and the Caribbean. Over these 5 decades, we have worked on successful projects in sustainable agriculture, natural resource management, and climate change, and we will continue to promote inclusive green development in the region, such as through this initiative. This webinar series that continues today is a crucial space for dialogue and collective reflection. The drivers of change in the livestock sector are diverse and complex, ranging from economic aspects to technological advancements and socio-economic dynamics. Some of these topics were covered by the last 2 webinars, and today we will focus specifically on socio-economic drivers. Today, we aim to continue the conversation on which are the key drivers, how they work, and how collective we design strategies and implement actions for a sustainable transformation of livestock systems. My name is Maria Meraggio, and I'm thrilled to be your host for today's insightful section. Today, we're delving specifically on geopolitical and socio-economic drivers that are influencing the landscape of livestock systems. We have a packed agenda with esteemed keynote speakers and panelists who will share their perspectives on these crucial topics. Livestock systems are subject to diverse geopolitical and socioeconomic drivers. Some of these drivers of change have for decades shaped demand for livestock products, including population growth, urbanization, and income growth. Factors such as population, consumer perception, financing, among other factors. Before we dive into our agenda, let me provide you with a brief overview of the methodology we will be following. We will begin with a welcome address by Ms. Shirley Tarawali, Chair of GASL, followed by Mr. Mohammed Ibrahim, Director General of CATIE. We will also have an introduction from Mr. Henning Steinfeld, who will provide a context on what are those change drivers and how they are shaping the livestock sector. We will then have a keynote speaker from Mr. David Anderson, Professor of Livestock Economics at Texas A&M University, on geopolitical and socioeconomic drivers of change. We will then have some comments from the audience and a brief intermission between panels. We'll then continue to the discussion with 2 main panels. The first one will focus on general drivers affecting demand and supply, while the last one will focus specifically on consumer perception and climate finance drivers. We encourage you to participate through the platform Slido, featuring questions we have prepared for you. We look forward to receiving your numerous interactions through this platform, and your comments are essential as we are compiling your ideas and your proposals. Having said this, I would like to welcome Ms. Shirley Tarawali, Chair of GASL, Assistant Director of the General of ILRI, the International Livestock Research Institute based in Nairobi, Kenya. She is Chair of the Global Agenda for Sustainable Livestock, and she will commence with our welcome address. You have the floor, Ms. Tarawali.
Thank you, Marielle, and good day to everyone. And thank you all so much for joining this online webinar that, as you heard, is the last in a series of 3 webinars exploring drivers in relation to livestock systems. These webinars are organized by the Global Agenda for Sustainable Livestock, or GAZL, as you will hear us refer to it, together with CATIE, the Tropical Research and Higher Education Center in Costa Rica. And really at this juncture, I must say a huge thank you to our colleagues at CATIE, as well as the GAZL Secretariat, supported by FAO in Rome, for making this webinar series happen. Thank you too to all the speakers and panelists, and to all of you who've made time to join what I hope will be a rich and stimulating, as well as action-oriented discussion today. If you've missed the others, I believe they will be available, or if they may be already, online. And I do encourage both the CATIE and GAZL teams to make sure that those are really well circulated. I can see that the numbers of participants have dropped off a little bit as the series has progressed, perhaps understandably, but I know there's a lot of interest, and so it's important that the recordings are made widely available. As you heard, my name is Shirley Tarawali. I'm chair of the Global Agenda for Sustainable Livestock and Assistant Director General at ILRI, the International Livestock Research Institute in Kenya. I'm just going to use these few moments now to frame what the Global Agenda for Sustainable Livestock, GAZL, is, what its ambitions are, and how this series of webinars relates to that. So firstly, the Global Agenda for Sustainable Livestock is a rather unique multi-stakeholder partnership that brings together all types of livestock stakeholders, from smallholders to commercial and everything in between, and all types of organizations, NGOs, governments, academia, public and private sector, civil society, and multilateral organizations. Through playing this unique adding together role, GAZL works to assemble evidence, foster dialogue and consensus around livestock-related issues to support practice and policy change towards sustainable livestock solutions that contribute both to development ambitions as described in the GAZL vision that says this: by 2030, sustainable, inclusive, resilient, and diverse livestock systems across the world contribute significantly to the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN Agenda 2030 and are integral to sustainable food systems. Achieving this vision is framed around 4 sustainability domains, and these are food and nutrition security, livelihoods and economic growth, animal health and welfare, and climate and natural resource use. One of the key ways that GAZL works to create those opportunities for this huge diversity of livestock stakeholders, the many systems and environments they represent, to come together and identify actions that support more sustainable and resilient livestock systems, and in turn, more sustainable and resilient food systems and better development outcomes, is through a multi-stakeholder partnership meeting, usually held annually in a different location around the world. This year's meeting is themed Multi-Stakeholder Collaboration to Strengthen Sustainability and Resilience of Livestock Systems in Response to Drivers of Change, and it will take place in late October in Chiang Mai, Thailand. This global meeting will be preceded by a series of 8 regional consultations that really provide an opportunity for regional livestock stakeholders to explore how different drivers impact on livestock systems and how and where a multi-stakeholder approach in each region could foster greater sustainability and resilience. So I think you can already see the connection of that with this webinar. Because while we're aware, very well aware in many cases, of multiple drivers that generally impact on livestock systems and which are and must continue to be addressed, we know about things like population growth, urbanization, increasing incomes, concerns about livestock environmental and health impacts. These are to some extent perhaps what we could call slow drivers. They've been recognized and have been evolving over several decades. But now we recognize as well, and the whole world does, and continues to recognize and grapple with many what we could call unexpected, and in some cases sudden and dramatic even drivers of change that have multiple implications for many aspects of life, including for livestock systems. The climate crisis, the COVID pandemic, the war in Ukraine, and a slate of new technologies and so on. So to better prepare for these regional and eventually global multi-stakeholder consultations, and to make sure that the actions and solutions arising out of these are well informed, we commissioned this series of webinars, bringing together experts from across the world to provide their views on key drivers, what these mean for the four sustainability domains, and especially how GAZL's unique multi-stakeholder nature can support greater sustainability and resilience of livestock systems in the face of all these drivers. The drivers we identified are environmental and technological innovation drivers, health and disease drivers, and geopolitical and socio-economic drivers. That last one being the focus of today's webinar. So again, a very warm welcome. I hope you will find this a rich and informative session. And again, my thanks to all who have made it possible and to those taking part today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Awali, for your kind welcoming words. We now welcome Mr. Mohammed Ibrahim, Director General of CATIE. He is Doctor of Agricultural and Environmental Science, and he has more than 26 years research experience on livestock and environment. He contributed to generating knowledge on silvopastoral systems and quantification of ecosystem services in these systems, which are being used in the development of policies for climate-smart livestock systems. Mr. Ibrahim, you now have the floor for 10 minutes.
Thank you, Marielle. From CATIE, we extend our greetings and welcome to all participants to the third and final webinars of the series, Key Drivers of Change in Livestock Systems and the Impact on Sustainability and Resilience. We want to thank the Global Agenda for Sustainable Livestock and FAO to give the opportunity to organize this series of webinars. But more importantly, we thank the speakers for providing time and their insights to better understand which are the drivers and how they work and actions to achieve sustainable livestock systems. In the previous webinars, we had the opportunity to understand better how environmental, technological innovations and health and disease drivers are shaping livestock systems. Today's webinar will focus on geopolitical and socio-economic drivers shaping livestock systems. The speakers will cover a range of drivers such as population growth, income expansion, urbanization, consumer perception, such as climate, finance, geopolitical tensions, armed conflicts, among others, that affect supply and demand of livestock systems and products. And more recently, the impacts of inflation and rising costs of prices and inputs are some of the issues also that have been key drivers that we need to attend. The speakers will also uncover the intricate connections between population growth and income expansion and demand for animal products. Urbanization is reshaping consumption patterns, leading to diversified diets, which increase animal production consumption, shifting distribution, marketing, and processing. Trade liberalization offers market opportunities, but exposes livestock stakeholders to competition and risk, including shift on the environmental footprints. Geopolitical tensions, armed conflicts, and value chain disruption has created scarcity of production factors and inflation of livestock products, affecting low-income countries and disproportionately, as well as the panelists will highlight how these dynamics act across regions, affecting developing and developed nations differently. It's very important to note that while we're at the crossroads of the discussion of livestock systems, On one hand, we have inequities in terms of consumption, where people are not consuming sufficient animal proteins, which have impacts on the health and also in terms of the cognitive capacity. On the other hand, we have a population which is, based on what the Eat Lancet report has promoted, is having an overconsumption, and therefore the discourse of the relationship between livestock and the environmental and ecological footprint has bring on to the debate of the discussions. For this reason, we need to provide convincing evidence of the importance that livestock is playing from a social economic perspective, and its importance in terms of being part of the solution of the impacts of climate change, biodiversity loss, etc. Kati is working on these three pillars, working on university and training, but also higher education, providing building capacity, systemic research, but also providing policymakers with the tools. We hope that this meeting is going to be a successful meeting and continue the dialogue on towards the Thailand report. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ibrahim, for your kind welcoming words. Before we move on to our next speaker, we would like to remind everyone that we will share via the chat some questions through the Slido platform. We would appreciate your comments, and this way it allows us to interact directly with you on what are your thoughts on this interesting topic. So you can find this information in the chat at the moment. As we move forward, let's set the stage for the discussion with Mr. Henning Steinfeld. Dr. Steinfeld is a German agricultural economist, currently serves as consultant for GASO and previously headed the livestock sector analysis and policy branch at FAO in Rome. He brings extensive expertise in agricultural and livestock policy with a particular focus on environmental issues, poverty alleviation, and public health. Furthermore, he's the author of key books related to the themes of this webinar series on livestock long shadow and livestock in a changing landscape. He will share insight on change drivers, how they're shaping the livestock sector regionally and globally in the framework of the 4 GASO sustainability domains. Mr. Steinfeld, you now have the floor for 15 minutes.
Thank you, Ariel, and good morning, good day, everyone. I've been asked to support the team with some observations and some issues that we want to consider. So this is about drivers and how we can look at drivers in the context of change and livestock systems. And it really started off with what Shirley said about the multiple crises that we currently find ourselves in, and importantly for development and UN organizations, that the UN Agenda 2030 in almost all indicators are off track. So we observe a rapid pace of change, growing instability, and the risk of disruption, and this translates into mounting challenges for livestock systems. And the idea was that the global agenda may be the right place to look at what we can do to respond to change and to identify pathways for adjustment and transformation. Next one, please. So simply to suggest that we use the word driver in the context a little bit of models that have been developed over the last 30 years, mainly in environmental sciences, that look at how drivers translate into pressures on environmental states with certain impacts, causing then stakeholders to respond. And we would like to put this model within the agri-food systems approach that not only looks at primary production, but looks at feed and energy, land use, biodiversity, the health aspects, all in conjunction. And we do that by then looking at what is the impact on those 4 sustainability domains that Shirley has already mentioned. And the suggestion is also not to really look at long-term future outcomes, but to stay within this decade, so to say, to look at what has happened in the last 3-4 years since 2020 maybe, and how we can react to change by 2030. So I've altered my presentation from here on to go back to what the model looks like. Could you turn page, please? So this is the driver's pressure state impact response model, where drivers, could you click again? Well, drivers would be the changing conditions usually caused by human activities that have sort of global reach often and are substantive changes in the operating environment. These drivers translate into different forms of pressure, which are the more direct effects of drivers. And these pressures then have an impact that they change livestock systems, which we here define as a state. So this is really the current condition in which rather diverse systems find themselves in. And then the proposal is to look at what is the impact of that change on those 4 domains that the global agenda is interested in. And the impact, both positive and negative, will trigger a response by decision makers and policy makers. Could you move, please? One more slide. The response can have different directions. The response can directly tackle the drivers, so the fundamental causes of a problem, or it can address the pressure, which is more the immediate environment of those people that we are concerned about. And then state and impact. Impact here, if you move at impact would be like you would repair the damage that has been caused and not really have looked at what you may do to avoid the problem in the first place. So I can illustrate this by the example, can you move on, of environmental drivers. So the drivers that we have identified very roughly here, it's only by way of example, but changing climate, resource scarcity, and higher environmental variability seem to be major drivers when it comes to environmental conditions of livestock. These drivers translate into different forms of pressure. So you would have issues of prices of feed and water. You would have access problems in some places. You would have also expect to have competition over resources. And you will also have an impact on the disease pressure to which livestock systems are exposed. So moving to the state, you would then have different issues in different systems because these livestock systems are having a different exposure, a different capability to respond to these pressures. So in the case of environment, we have some livestock systems which are fully exposed to open nature, to natural ecosystems almost, whereas there are also systems which are totally modified, where there's no direct environment to speak of. It is all human controlled. So then the next step would be you look at the drivers, you would look at the impact domains, those 4 areas that the global agenda is interested in, and then there would be some sort of response. Just very quickly to the next slide, the health drivers are quite similar, but maybe also worth looking at the drivers that have been identified for what concerns the emergence and spread of disease are globalization, roughly, very broadly speaking. So the movements of products, of people, tourism, and so on. These movements create are a driver of livestock emergence and spread. Change in ecosystems, that environmental change, for example, favors certain diseases like tick-borne diseases in some places. And consumer demands for healthy food and different attributes of food is another important health driver. So this is just by way of example. Then the pressure area, so you look at where this actually impacts, where this translates into pressure for livestock systems, is the disease pressure, the biosecurity requirements, and the market access of prices would be example of the pressure that livestock systems are exposed to. And then you move around, again, exposure and resilience of current livestock systems, and you would again look at the different impact of these changes on those 4 domains. Can you move? So the response, as I've said before, you may want to address the driver, which is like mitigating climate change, for example, would be a way to also reduce the driver's impact on the whole system. If you look at the pressure, you may want to call it, this is like adapting to change. It's not really looking at the fundamental causes, but is keeping the environment operational. You want to monitor the state, and if you have damage, you need to repair. So you can, your response can address the drivers, it can address the pressure, and it can address the impact. So move on, please. Next slide. The drivers of change behave in quite different ways, and I think it is important to keep this also in mind when we discuss it. The direction of change and shape of change can be quite different. There are slow-moving things that Shirley has mentioned, and there are some very rapid changes that move more like exponential curves. The time scale, we have short-term, we have long-term trends and drivers. We also have the issue of space. So not all drivers have the same importance everywhere. They differ from location to location and affecting also different populations, of course. And some of these drivers, they work together. There is positive interaction among those drivers, but there's also negative interaction or antagonistic relationship. And keeping in mind that while those livestock systems are driven by those drivers, they are also themselves drivers of change. So this two-way relationship is something that we also need to keep in mind. So I think these are my sort of initial suggestions and observations on the subject. Over to you or back to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Seinfeld. Now we would perhaps check out the questions that you have been responding through the Slido, see if we have any comments so far. As you can see, the question that we pose is what you think in one word is the most influential geopolitical and socio-economic driver. We see here we have public policy, climate, traceability. So I guess these are some of the main ideas. Competitiveness, perfect. So if you want to comment on this, feel free to participate. The idea is that we get to see how or what your thoughts are specifically on the most influential drivers in this topic. Now we will continue with our next session or the next thematic segment. Let's delve into the status of geopolitical and socio-economic drivers impacting livestock systems. For this, we're honored to have Mr. David Anderson, professor and extensive economics, Texas A&M University. His extension, education, and research activities are in livestock and food products, marketing, and agricultural policy. He's the Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Livestock and Food Products Marketing Economist, advising livestock farmers for over 30 years. Likewise, Dr. Anderson has a long track record of research on livestock markets and the impact of alternative farm programs on the livestock, dairy, and crop sectors of agriculture. Mr. Anderson will delve into geopolitical and socioeconomic drivers of change and how they shape the historical and future growth and challenges of livestock system. Mr. Anderson will be speaking for the next 20-25 minutes, and I will be letting you know when you have 5 minutes left. Thank you.
Maybe. How's that? Can you see that okay?
Yeah, it's just we can see your moderating.
Oh gosh, not again. Let me try that again real fast here.
Of course.
No, not yet. Well, I'll tell you what, let's just leave that on there. And if that's okay with you guys, we'll move on with the talk. It's okay with me if it's okay with you. First off, I want to thank you for inviting me to be part of this. It's a real honor to be part of this this program that you have. And I think it brings up continues to bring up some really tremendous questions about the future of livestock and meat production. And so I want to kind of jump into this in a couple of ways. Certainly, my name's David Anderson. I'm here at Texas A&M. And again, it's a pleasure to be with you and part of this, I think, really great program. And I must say that the previous speaker, I listened to him, and there were a couple things I would change in my slides based on what he said. So I think that's pretty good too. We'll try to just certainly work through this. So, I think driver number one I would mention is certainly incomes. And, I'm going to mention a number of drivers, and quite honestly, they're like a Venn diagram. They all relate to each other. They all overlap. They all drive each other. So there are things I want to mention in each one of these that will spill over to the next slide, that will have had and will continue to have an impact. I think, I think one of the things that I find that, for me, as I think about these problems and issues, I find are comforting. And that is that, many of these have gone on forever. There, in some regard, there's nothing new to some of these. I think incomes is one of those. Rising incomes around the world, as folks' incomes go up, they upgrade the diet. Yes, sir.
Dave, excuse me. Can you click on swap display?
Will that do it? There we go.
All right.
Hey,
go ahead.
Hey, thanks.
Welcome.
I was actually worried about clicking that before because I thought I'd turn the whole thing off. So, well, anyway, really, as we think about this, rising incomes for over time, we change our diets. We upgrade our diets. And really, that has happened forever. I think it's important to note that that as our earlier speaker mentioned, these changes are not necessarily linear, but sometimes exponential. We've seen very rapid growth in incomes. And because of that, we rapidly change our diets. And yet, as we do that, as folks' incomes go up, there's this need for infrastructure, and we have this infrastructure change. And I mentioned roads, a cold chain that keeps meat cold from where it's produced to where it's consumed, and growth and investment in infrastructure in those areas. And it's hand in hand with technology. I think we can look back in time, the invention of railroads, interstate highways, cars, refrigerated trucks, the things that allow us to get these products from where they're produced to where they're consumed in a much higher quality and much higher amounts, really has driven hand in hand part of demand growth. And so in some parts of the world, we have a need for infrastructure growth. And yet that's the same even in what we might think of as the developed world, maybe, if I can use that term. Even in the US, when I look at that, we have huge investment happening in terms of cold chain, cold storage. Yet it's because our trade continues to grow. Both our exports and our imports create the need for more of that. So even here, we have investment in that infrastructure going on. And I would point out too, as we've moved to freer trade, we've reduced trade barriers. That's been part of improving incomes. It's driven some economic growth. I would argue it's led to lower meat prices, particularly in importing countries. And so part of our economic growth over the last several decades has been driven by movement towards freer trade. And so that's part of this income growth going on. So, really income growth is driving profitability and increases in production. I think the second thing I would focus on as a big driver of change is really trade. This idea that freer trade has led to economic growth. It's led to rising incomes. I would argue it's led to lower prices for some consumers around the world. It's led to higher prices in others as we think of some exporting countries. one of the challenges here, though, is I would argue that the push for reducing trade barriers has certainly waned. We've seen just in the last several years retaliatory tariffs back and forth, countries putting tariffs on, retaliation, further retaliation, all of those leading to increasing these trade tensions. And I think while not, I can think of a couple of examples of export bans in meat. Certainly the most recent are bans on rice exports. This really slowdown in reducing trade barriers and these actions are leading to more volatility, more price risk, more income risk, and just plain more uncertainty in the market, which leads to more trade tensions, which I would argue is a real challenge for the future. Yet that's not uniform. We certainly have areas with bilateral country negotiations that are leading to reduced trade barriers, that are leading to expanded trade. And so it's not a blanket overall reduction, but it is, there are bright spots and dark spots in this. And within that too, overall tensions, we certainly the Russian invasion of Ukraine has led to certainly trade problems there. Although, I might argue that perhaps there's much more serious issues in that war than just the trade part. But that war spills over into really increasing the risk of food security and prices and incomes for so many people around the world that are already may have economic struggles and food insecurity as it is. But trade has really led to growing production. It's led to the economic incentive for more meat. And really this increasing production for many years, we've been increasing meat production, and I'll speak for the U.S. in this regard. If we look at our meat industries, we've had a market incentive to do that. We've had profits. Profits have driven increased production. We've certainly faced that in our domestic market as incomes have gone up, even here over decades, as incomes rise, we've increased production. We've increased production not only in terms of the number by increasing weight per animal, but the number of offspring per animal, whether it's through nutrition or genetics, we've been steadily increasing production. In fact, if I used a U.S. example, last year in 2022, we set an all-time record for beef production. Now, some of that's because we've been reducing our cattle herd because of drought and a lack of profits, so more cows went to market, but we certainly have seen a trend of increasing production. If we looked at our pork industry, for example, we've been increasing production almost every year for several decades now, really as we've adopted new technology, from management technology to nutrition to genetics, yet most of that growth has been for an export market. Our per capita consumption here of pork is not really all that changed over the last 25 years, but our growth in production is really driven by exports. I think we ought to think about this overlapping in terms of sustainability and resource use, is that as we increase production, we're increasing resource use. But we're also seeing greater efficiency, increasing productivity, reducing the amount of feed per pound of gain. And so if we think about these, we may increase the overall resource use, but our resources per pound of production is going down. And so, I think that's one of the things for the future as we look at growth in terms of efficiency of technology use, that the opportunities to be a much more efficient and growing industry worldwide is certainly there. And so we'll see, I would argue, in other countries, increasing productivity, rates of change in productivity that will match some of the things we've already done here, and in terms of the U.S. So this idea of greater efficiency, I think there are huge gains to be made worldwide there in terms of increasing production. I want to show you two charts, and I've sort of touched on this a little bit, but if we think about gains, this is beef production per cow in the U.S. I just went back, back to the late 90s, but we have a trend of increasing production per cow. Largely, that's coming from increased weights, larger animals, more pounds per animal, increased feeding. But that productivity per animal in this regard continues to increase. And so that has an upward trend. Yet you'll see some ups and downs, some of these downs, we look at 2015, 14 and 15, for instance, and it's really related to instead of that we held young animals, we held heifers back to increase the size of our cow herd following a drought. So those were pulled out of the production system, pulled out of meat production and held back to produce more cattle. And so that leads to that decline, but yet that overall trend in terms of production per cow is increasing even here. If I look on the hog side, it's a little different story, and it really leads to technology change, production technology, genetics, increasing the number of pigs saved per litter, the number of litters per year, as this industry has increasingly fine-tuned production, and we see really dramatic increases in productivity. And so the opportunity in terms of sustainability, yet meeting the growing demands of consumers around the world with growing incomes, is I think there are huge opportunities to see growth in efficiency and productivity that aid both sides of this. So a little bit on sustainability of things that I think about pointing out for the future. One of the things that jumps to my mind right away as we think about this, what are going to be the rules or regulations of the road for how markets work? And market driven, what kind, and when I say market driven, how do markets react to whether it's government policy or regulations created by companies due to trying to meet or even company driven goals for sustainability, and what those certifications are going to look like. I think one of the difficulties we may have is we may create different rules in different countries that are going to create differential costs. They're going to change incentives and profitability between different countries that lead to really, I think, some issues in terms of trade, in terms of relative production costs between exporters and importers, and so how those work out between different countries, I think is important for future growth. Certainly a changing climate. We certainly do have a changing climate. It changes costs. It changes production risks. I think if we looked in some areas of the world, some areas, the risk is that they will no longer be profitable for production, even whether we're thinking about grazing lands and grazing systems, or even in terms of later finishing systems or more confined animal feeding operations. This change is going to affect regions differently, and I think we already see that even here with increased drought, changing cattle numbers in some location of cattle numbers, for instance. Yet I still think in terms of sustainability there are technology gains that really has, I think, the opportunity to affect how we grow. I think the other thing I would say is in terms of sustainability, I think livestock are part of a sustainable food system. Certainly, as we look at grazing systems, as we have more emphasis here on grazing systems, livestock, more in some cases more intensive grazing systems, but move the animals more frequently. As we look at more of these things, as we build a more sustainable food system, I think grazing systems are part of that, and I think livestock is part of that. And so, again, I think that's an opportunity. There are certainly risks there, but I think there's an opportunity there as well. I think one of the other things that comes to my mind in this, in terms of sustainability and consumer demand, growing incomes, growing demand for meat leads us to profitability and market incentives, and we're growing production. Yet how this translates to consumers, I think, is pretty important. And I'm just going to say it this way: are consumers really going to value these sustainability labels? Will they value it so that they're willing to pay more for that if given a choice in the marketplace? Does this become something that maybe a subset of consumers in wealthier companies want, yet for others who are seeing incomes grow and boosting their meat consumption, changing their diets, upgrading their diets, may much more be interested in price and income? And so, I expect these differential market, almost a differentiation and further market segmentation within our populations across all of our countries. So, what characteristics are going to be valued most? The availability of a high quality, nutritious meat product on the market may be more important for a lot of other consumers. The nutritional attributes may be much more important. Of course, we think often of price, taste, quality, grade, if we're looking at some of the grading systems in some countries. Certainly cultural aspects of consumption are important. But this, we need to think about how this relates to consumer demand, growing incomes, how many people value these labels, and are they really willing to pay for them versus those that are much more interested in other attributes. So as I think about this topic, as we put this together, and I look at much of what I do here in terms of markets, policy changes related to livestock, I really see we have some challenges out there, but I also think there's tremendous opportunities. One, for demand growth, production growth, that brings some tensions, some other problems to deal with. How do we deal with waste? How do we deal with these things and limit or how we deal with environmental impacts of livestock production? But we also have a product that's in demand across all kinds of meat animals, meat species. So that demand growth and production growth, I think, brings huge opportunities, although it also brings some challenges. Growing trade is certainly another area where, to fuel growing demand, growing incomes, I think we're going to have growing trade, even though we have these trade tensions building and happening between countries and between regions. For many countries that exports are the growth market. For some of us, we tend to think that we have a more mature market. The growth is in other places. And so exports really become a growth market. Yet for countries that may be importers, but also producers, they may also be exporters, if we can think about some examples here, but building domestic consumer demand as well. It's not just exports, but it's building consumer demand. So overall, as I look at this, I really have an optimistic view of the future of livestock and meat production. I think we have a bunch of serious challenges, but the opportunities for growth and how we've met this growth that we've seen for many years, driven by these same long-term drivers, I think really creates to me a lot of, I think, optimistic opportunities for growth. In that having a product that's in demand, I think is that's a good thing. And so as we think about how we're going to do this, I think there's opportunities. And with that, that is my last slide. So I'll just say thank you for having me. I am a livestock economist with Texas A&M University, Texas A&M AgriLife Extension. So I do a wide variety of livestock, meat, dairy sector research projects, and I'm certainly glad to be with you and honored to be invited. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Anderson. We would like to open now the floor for questions, or if you have any comments specifically for Mr. Anderson. For this section, we're also going to have the participation of Mr. Danilo Peso. He's a lecturer and expert on livestock and environmental management at CATIE, Costa Rica, and co-editor of Tropical Grasslands Journal. Mr. Danilo, do you perhaps at the moment have a question specifically for Mr. Anderson?
Yes, Mariel. Thank you, Dr. Anderson, for your presentation. Very interesting. Before we, as we wait for other comments and questions from the floor, let me ask you a question. What we have seen from the data is that in the last century, the number of smallholder farmers has reduced in US, Canada, Europe, but that is not the case of the developing world. Where smallholder and landless livestock producers are the majority. And the other thing is that we observe also from data that we have gathered and other people have gathered is that the age of the farmers have increased, particularly in the developing world. The young people is not, very few young people is interested on farming, and that complicates us to see the future of agriculture production in general and livestock production in the developing world. Now, many of the options that you discuss, I think, even in the developing world, goes more for the large and medium-sized farmers. What are your views about the future of the smallholder and landless farmers in the developing world?
I think that's a great question. That's a I took that slide. I had a slide on this. I took it out because I thought it fit one of the earlier webinars better, and so I took it out. We face those same concerns here in terms of fewer farmers, older farmers, the next generation of farmers is, we do have young people coming in, but certainly farms are bigger. Commercial size farms are bigger. We do have growth in small farms as well, but this tension in terms of how do we deal with the challenge, or can we put policies in place to deal with the challenge of the structure of livestock agriculture in different countries where that structure is different? Are there things we can do to aid small farmers in seeing some of these improvements? Can we do some policies that help small farmers stay in business or thrive, whether it's genetic breeding stock or cooperatives that help with marketing, or some ways to organize where they can participate in some of this technology that's not scale neutral. And so I think that's a real challenge. I think, but are there some policies that we could work on to do that, to help farmers? I think so, but it is fair to say that many of these technologies are not scale neutral, and how we deal with that rather than just let things happen. Because as you said, we do have young people who are leaving agriculture and going to trying to find other opportunities. And so how can we do some things to allow small farmers to thrive and succeed? I think that's a big question, issue, problem, tension, whatever we want to call that. I think that's an important one.
Thank you very much, Mr. Anderson. We have a question from an audience member that says, well, Dr. Anderson, thank you for your presentation. Could you give us an example for what you call build domestic consumer demand from the US?
Yeah, so as I think of domestic consumer demand, if I think of our big three meat species, beef, pork, and chicken, we have a pretty dynamic changing consumer demands, not only within cuts between species, but overall. So, one of the challenges I think for us is, as I mentioned, we've grown pork production, yet per capita consumption has stayed relatively it has not changed a whole lot. All the growth has been in exports. That's certainly an area that can we see some change or growth in domestic demand for pork, for instance. And I might argue that some of it may very well be related to changes we made many years ago to create a leaner pork product. So the hogs today are very lean. Some would argue that in some of the cuts, they aren't as tasty. They tend to dry out in cooking more. It may very well have led to some problems with demand, where we may see some changes in production, in genetics and nutrition and things like that might lead to maybe boosting some domestic demand for that meat, for pork, particularly for individual pork cuts. And so that might be a good example. So I'll see if that one works as an example. I'll let the person with the question judge if that's a fair answer or not.
Great, thank you
But it's a darn good question.
Yeah, well, perhaps Mr. Bassler, who made the question, if you want any follow-up, just let us know through the chat. I guess for now, we also want to perhaps check out what comments and we have in our Slido platform. We have been receiving some comments on that specifically for some of the most influential geopolitical socio-economic drivers. We have some on trade barriers and cattle trafficking. Perhaps Mr. Anderson, I think, well, you talked about trade barriers. We've also, I think, well, before you mentioned on the situation of the war in Ukraine-Russia war and the impact that's been having on trade specifically. We see here comments, well, that yes, some are more positive and negative than others, perhaps. You did mention that, of course, there are some issues with the situation of the war in Ukraine that are much broader than just trade, of course. But how do you see in the US or in America in general, how the livestock systems have been affected by the dynamic of the war?
So if I was going to think just in terms of market and economics and that, that war, Ukraine's a major supplier of wheat. We think more of wheat as people food than animal feed, but also corn, which has gone to livestock production systems. So the loss of that certainly raises costs. I think the data would show that it's led to some higher, say, corn prices, feed costs here, because we participate in a world market. But at the same time, we're also very large exporters. Price signals have led farmers in the U.S. to, we've planted more corn. We have prices that are declining. Even with that turmoil in that market, we have falling prices and at least expectations of a very large crop again. And so, more on livestock, I think for us, it's more of an indirect effect through prices, through feed costs as well. And so I think that's where I would kind of think about, or at least for us, where more of those effects have been.
Very well. Thank you very much, Mr. Anderson. For now, we will move on for the next panel, or the next, let's say, section of our webinar now. Our expert panelists are ready to share their insights on the general socioeconomic and geopolitical drivers affecting demand and supply. For this session, each panelist will be speaking for about 10 minutes each, and we will then interact with them also through the questions and interventions from the audience. We encourage everyone that's participating today to feel free to leave your comments and questions on the chat. You can also raise your hand if you want to ask a specific question. Also, if you would like to make a question in another language that is not English, so if you want to make a question in Spanish, feel free to do so. We have the translation available, and we will be able to facilitate questions posed in Spanish as well. Okay, so for now, what we're going to do before we continue on to the next session, we will have just a quick break, less than 5 minutes. We're just going to show a video. Perhaps my colleagues can help me with the video, and we will be right back. Thank you.
In 2023, we are celebrating 50 years of providing solutions for inclusive green development. These are our main contributions. Since our inception in 1973, we have been committed to sustainable development, working to enhance human well-being and alleviate poverty in Latin America and the Caribbean. Our main lines of action to achieve this have been research, education, and outreach. With these lines of action, we have innovated in the integration of agriculture and the management, conservation, and sustainable use of natural resources. We promote the approach of agroforestry, which currently covers at least 200 million hectares in Latin America and the Caribbean. We create and distribute hybrid F1, selected varieties of coffee and cocoa clones that stand out for their high productivity, resilience to diseases, and excellent quality. Together with the Association of Forest Communities of Piton, we have pioneered the forest concession model. This model represents one of the most successful global examples of sustainable management of tropical forests. Our forest seed bank distributes its products to more than 47 countries worldwide. It currently ranks as one of the leading seed suppliers in Latin America. For the past 10 years, we have generated scientific evidence on the importance of blue carbon, making us pioneers in this field. Our research has allowed us to strengthen the schemes of payment for environmental services for the benefit of countries in Latin America. We develop plans for the proper management of water and soil, thereby contributing to the mitigation and adaptation of populations to climate change and extreme and recurring weather events. In our germplasm bank, we preserve more than 6,000 crop seeds for global food security. We demonstrate that the implementation of silvopastoral systems and other best livestock practices make sustainable, low-emission livestock farming viable. Through our botanical garden, hundreds of tourists from around the globe gain insights into tropical biodiversity. We have trained over 2,800 young people to become masters and leaders for change who are presently addressing the needs and challenges of the countries in the region. We have constructed a scientific and cooperation platform maintaining relationships with more than 400 partners. We organized the 8th Wallace Scientific Conference, which set the roadmap for transforming food systems in Latin America and the Caribbean. We had 170 participants from 20 countries, 12 high-level speakers, and the results of 100 research studies were shared to establish strategies towards sustainable, fair, and nutritious food systems.
Cuando nos acercamos a los 50 años del CATIE, lo que tenemos que hacer es redoblar los esfuerzos, pensar en el mandato histórico de esta institución y la necesidad de seguir generando y formando líderes que tienen desde las diferentes instituciones que ocupan, contribuir a la transformación de la agricultura de los trópicos, donde hay problemas de productividad, de sostenibilidad, donde necesitamos agregar valor, necesitamos incorporar a los jóvenes y a las mujeres.
Muchísimas gracias, ¿verdad? Una felicitación a nuestro querido director, don Mohamed Ibrahim, ¿verdad? Que siempre está dispuesto a colaborar y a facilitarnos todo lo que hemos puesto en el camino para darle un mejor servicio a la comunidad.
And I would like to wish Katia a very happy 50th birthday. Under the direction of DG Ibrahim, I've gotten to see firsthand some of the transformational work that Katia, together with its partners, has achieved in the region for the benefit of both people and nature.
We are steadfast in our commitment to continue contributing to inclusive green development and the transformation of agri-food systems.
Thank you very much and welcome back. As we resume, we're going to delve now, as I said before, into our panel on the status of geopolitical and social economic drivers. Remember, as always, we have the Slido session open. They will be receiving your first impressions, feedback, anything that you would like to comment. On this session, we're going to have our esteemed panelists are Dr. Alejandro Acosta, Dr. Francisco Abello, Dr. Yuri Khalil, and Dr. Carlos Pomareda. Our first panelist is Mr. Alejandro Acosta, Livestock Policy Officer, Livestock Policy Lab, Food and Agricultural from the FAO. Dr. Acosta is joining us. If you would like, perhaps, Mr. Acosta, you can just check if you can share your screen at the moment. Dr. Acosta has 20 years of working experience supporting the formulation of policy instruments and investment programs in various regions, including specific field positions in Latin America and the Caribbean, the Arab states of the Gulf, and Southern Africa. As livestock economist, his work focuses on the quantitative analysis of environmental, social, and economic policy issues with a strong track of publications relevant to this webinar. Mr. Acosta will now talk on the socio-economic and geopolitical drivers from a FAO perspective. Mr. Acosta, you now have the floor, and I will let you know when you have 5 minutes left.
Thank you. So thank you very much for inviting me to deliver this, to participate in this panel. This is a topic that I believe we have been discussing and dealing for more than a decade. I mean, I will say that nearly 1 out of 10 of the publications from the livestock sector starts by saying driven by population and income growth, and then they elaborate on the positive and negative externalities of that development. So I assume that this is not something new, and I wonder until what extent the sector will be in the capacity to shape some of these drivers. One can become very skeptical about the full potential of the sector for two main factors. One is because many of these drivers are exogenous shocks, And second, because often our counterparts are more implementers, including in many countries, ministers of agriculture, rather than counterparts that are actually leading with changes in the factors of production that eventually will shape supply. So I'm a livestock economist at the Animal Production Health Division at FAO, and currently have the pleasure and the honor to coordinate a group of economists that are committed to generate strong analytical evidence that could be used to frame policy issues, facilitate policy dialogue, and support the design of policy instruments. When I was thinking about this presentation, I consult a number of documents that have talked about drivers in agriculture. FAO have produced some of these. A couple of years ago, FAO launched a publication called Transforming the Livestock Sector Through the SDGs, where I believe many of these drivers are well covered. However, for this presentation, I think that it will be interesting to systematize or to analyze them from two different angles. One is which of those drivers will affect demand, and then which of those drivers will affect supply. Very easily, one can argue that that kind of splitting some of those drivers is extremely difficult because some of them directly or indirectly might be affecting both. But for the purpose of this presentation, I think that it's interesting to use this scheme. And as have been mentioned before, there are very obvious and traditional drivers: population, economic growth. So I will try to add some additional points to what have been already discussed. In terms of population, what this graph is trying to illustrate is that although the global population is going to increase by around 25% by 2050, there are going to be important changes in that population change. So while in Africa, we are expecting population to increase to around 80%. That depends on the scenario that we use. We are using here the medium variant projection scenario. In regions such as Europe, actually, we will expect a decrease in population. So the question is, will that increase in domestic demand be captured by those domestic economies? Through trade, that is not necessarily the case. I believe that in many of these countries, the increase in demand will indeed be satisfied through imports. So I believe that one interesting question is, until what extent domestic demand will shape the future of those production systems in those regions? Then, as we know and has been already mentioned, there is a very strong linkage between economic growth and livestock demand, or the income elasticity for demand. But what is interesting for this graph is to see how strong that linkage is in comparison to other economic sectors. So in the case, for example, of the US, an increase in income of around 1% could lead to an increase of a similar magnitude in the demand for livestock products. This is a meta-analysis conducted by this author. It's long time ago. It's very interesting when you are trying to look for evidence to support this narrative. The gap and the lack of evidence is this. I think that this is a very interesting output of this presentation. Is, we need to review, and we need to have more updated evidence in order to be able to have a better perspective about where the sector is going. So in this figure, we can have a more clear idea of the potential and challenges for different countries. We have here two extremes. On the one side, we have the United States with more than 130 kilograms of meat consumption per year. And then we have countries such as Burundi. Something interesting here is that we can see how close or how far we are from the minimum meat consumption intake recommended by WHO, 58 kilograms. But perhaps if we compare countries that are at the same level of economic growth, to give an example, India and Myanmar, we can see how different the level of consumption is, although they have a similar level of GDP per capita. And that's drives me to the next slide, which is the issue of consumers' preferences and the structure of demand. So again, here we have two countries with similar levels of consumption, the United States and Portugal, and we can appreciate how different the structure of that demand looks like in terms of different types of livestock products and commodities. On the opposite side, we have Ethiopia, also with a low level of consumption and in a very defined structure in the demand for meat products. There are interesting aspects related to food inflation, but at the end of the day, I believe that is, how prices are going to increase in the future and what will be the effect on demand. So if we compare these two previous trends, population and economic growth, we can see that those two trends are synergetic, but on the other hand, we see some antagonism with the fact that as factors of production become more scarce, food prices will certainly increase, and that is going to have an effect that will differ between countries and regions, depending on the level of income, on the potential for substitution. So I think that what is coming out of this first part of the presentation is that these drivers doesn't have a clear, straightforward effect, but there are plenty of dynamics and complexities that will actually define how the sector could look like. The same apply those differences not only among countries but production systems. So again, here we have different production systems with different price elasticities of demand. On the left-hand side, we have, for example, poultry minus 0.6, and on the other land minus 0.9, which illustrates a little bit how important that commodity can be for the demand of a household, for the household expenditure, and the substitution possibilities for those households. Now, if we move to the supply part, an interesting concept that I believe requires a little bit of refining is the way how we're understanding productivity. Increasing partial factor productivity is difficult, but it's not as such a huge challenge if we contrast that with increasing total factor productivity. So, for example, increasing the productivity of meat per land by substituting land per capital is difficult, but it's more difficult if you are trying to increase the productivity of all factors of production simultaneously, which I believe is the true challenge and is what is going to happen in the future. As factors of production become more scarce, it will be more difficult to substitute the use of inputs and to mobilize some factors of production in order to increase output. Something that I would like to highlight here is the fact that although productivity is growing, in this case, we are using as example the cattle production system using output in monetary terms, the level of growth has differed between regions and within regions among countries. So in this particular case, we can see the level of growth of cattle output in Brazil, 2.2, in comparison to the level of total factor productivity growth of cattle in Botswana, 0.9. So if one goes back to the previous slides that shows that income and population are going to increase, especially in the sub-Saharan region, one starts wondering until what extent the production systems in those regions will be able to capture the benefit of those growth, of that growth, or actually that will come mostly from the increasing supply in other markets. We tend to think a lot about the potential of the sector to contribute to these challenges by the increasing productivity, efficiency change. Recently, we launched a publication which highlights the effect of macroeconomic policies in driving or in shaping the future of the sector. And this is what this graph here is trying to illustrate. We analyze the market competitiveness gap in Argentina for dairy using an indicator that is the effective rate of protection. And we combine and we split that analysis in two main types of production systems, one extensive, one intensive. And what we can observe here is how the level of competitiveness, or let's say the economic sustainability of the sector, change and varies depending on those macroeconomic policies. In this case, the price of inputs, the price of outputs, taxes, import quotas, and policies related. So one comment here is there are plenty of macroeconomic aspects, starting from the exchange rate, that will play a major role, perhaps much more higher than what microeconomic interventions will do. One of those factors is related to the level of market efficiency, and specifically the level of. We conducted recently an analysis in China where we estimate the effect that the reduction in supply due to African swine fever had on prices, and how those prices and how that shock was transmitted along the food supply chain. And what this graph or this result tries to illustrate is the different effect between consumers and producers. So here we see that the shock on pork prices was of around 40%, an increase of 40% in prices, while in hog prices, on producers' prices, it was just around 20%. So if those market signals are not transmitted efficiently from consumers to producers, it is going to be very difficult that producers in some regions of the world will have the capacity to respond to those trends as they could do in a region where the level of market is more efficient. Another interesting aspect here is the cross dynamics between different commodities. So we also estimate the effect on substitute markets like beef and chicken. And this is interesting because we can see that the effect of that a driver will have in one specific part of the system will certainly affect or could affect the whole system. We try to do something similar in the terms of productivity, but looking at short and long-term investments. And here in the blue line, we have the change in short-term efficiency due to investments, and the red line, the long-term efficiency due to investments in the sector. And in many of these countries, in regions, we can notice that the blue line is above the red line, meaning that while the short-term efficiency, while productivity is increasing in the short term, in the long term, that line is not moving. In other words, investments are important and are having a positive effect on driving up productivity, but perhaps it's more important to sustain those investments over time for a longer period of time to actually be able to drive long-term productivity up. And this is related to the policy implications of different type of governments, whether the governments are changing every 4 years or 5 years, whether the same parties remain in power or not, whether the same priorities remain. So this is an aspect that I think is going to play the fundamental role in the coming years, how stable the political decisions will become in terms of increasing productivity or transforming the sector. Just to start closing my presentation, there are 2 aspects that I would like to highlight. First, an aspect that I will say is perhaps one of the most important in shaping the future of the sector, the issue of carbon markets. But at this, I will say that is a very unknown driver still. From this graph, I would like to highlight the differences in prices, not only between mandatory and voluntary markets, but within mandatory markets and within voluntary markets. There are 2 different lines of thought on these markets. Some project that prices are going to increase significantly, tenfold in the next 20, 30 years. Others believe that actually prices are going to drop as there is an increase of supply. We saw what happened with carbon markets in 2012, where they went from $10 per ton to nearly 0.5. And there is some, let's say, level of risk about how these markets could behave in the future. One of the aspects that are being discussed in that regards is whether under, for example, the clean development mechanisms, credits from previous projects will be able to be allocated into the market. And the other aspect will be until what extent those all, let's say, low quality credits will also bombard the market. So there is still a lot of speculation, a lot of uncertainty, but perhaps the most important message that is coming out of the recent evidence on this regard is that below $30, it is very unlikely to see a major change in the abatement of emissions from this type of mechanisms. In other words, most papers are arguing that prices will need to increase at least 5 times from current prices if we want to see that mechanism playing a more important role. Finally, on this regards, we conducted an analysis in Uruguay where we assess the effect that different market-based instruments will have on different type of economic outcomes. In this particular case, I'm illustrating the issue of investments, the effect on GDP, and we tried to compare 3 different instruments. One was one subsidy, then we use a cap and trade mechanism, and then a tax. And what is interesting from this figure is that the short and long-term effects of these mechanisms will or can differ totally. So while in the short term, we might expect subsidies to have a higher effect on GDP. We can see that in the very long term, perhaps cap and trade mechanisms might lead to a higher outcome on these regards. This is quite sensitive because then the discussion starts between producers and consumers, who will lose, who will gain. And in this particular example, the policy discussion led to the exclusion of some of those instruments because the producers believe that the most desirable instrument might have a higher cost on them. So the issue of political economy and until what extent some of those instruments will pass the political debate might be an important aspect at the time of implementing some of those mechanisms. Finally, production standards. Here I'm comparing the effect of reducing antimicrobial use in poultry by 2032 and how the adoption of that standard will affect countries and how different countries that have advanced or are advancing faster or slower will be able to capture some of the benefits that will created or the opportunities that will created by the adoption of those standards. In this particular case, we can see that in countries such as Brazil, reducing the use of antimicrobials currently being used partially as a growth promoters will have a negative effect on production, a reduction of about 5%, and that part of that decrease could be capitalized by regions such as the European Union or countries such as the United States. That reduction in supply will also affect imports, exports, and consumption. So again, the outcome of those drivers are very likely are complex, are not linear, and having a clear idea of where the sector is going might be more challenging than just thinking that population and income growth is going to lead to an increase in demand. We have developed this analytical framework that has been recently published in the Journal of Policy Modeling, where we put together a kind of general equilibrium model to help practitioners, policy analysts assess the effect of some of those drivers. Something that could be highlighted from this framework is that depending where the driver, where the shock is assessed, there is a potential for the outcome to be totally different. So, for example, if we assume that the effect of prices will be through an increase in import prices and you will affect the rest of the world, the effect that shock will differ if we assume that the increase in prices is due to an increase in households' income and demand. So having a framework that is fit for the purpose of analyzing these challenges will be important to assist policy analysts in trying to better understand these complexities. These are some of the driving questions that came to my mind when I was preparing this presentation. So an important aspect will be, how do we want to shape the sector, especially if we want to bring on board to this discussion stakeholders from sectors that are not the traditional ones. For example, the Ministry of Planning and Development, the Ministry of Finance. I believe that they will ask for a clear picture of where and why we want to drive the sector. Will these drivers lead to more sustainable livestock food systems alone? If not, what type of policy interventions are needed to ensure the desired outcomes? Where should we put or allocate these incentives or disincentives? How will these instruments affect producers and consumers? And how to shape the political economy to ensure higher welfare levels? So thank you very much for your time. Over to you, Melissa.
Thank you very much, Mr. Acosta. Thank you very much for your presentation. We will now continue to our second panelist. Mr. Francisco Abello is an assistant professor in the Department of Agricultural Economics at Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service. Mr. Abello provides district leadership and coordination for extension education programs. He has more than 20 years working on livestock production, extension service, and farm ranch management. The co-authors of this presentation are Dr. Yuri Khalil and Dr. Samuel Zapata, two professors and extension economists at Texas A&M with relevant experience for this webinar. Dr. Abello and Dr. Yuri will talk about geopolitical drivers affecting livestock sector from the perspective of the case of Latin America, specifically in Argentina and Brazil. Mr. Abello and Dr. Yuri, you have 10 minutes, and I will let you know on the chat when you have 5 minutes left.
Thank you very much. Let me share. Okay, can you see? Does it look good? Does it look okay? The presentation?
Yes, perfect. We can see
Excellent.
it now.
Thank you very much. Well, today's presentation, I'm going to start first, and then I will let Yuri, the second half of the presentation to do it. Basically, Yuri is going to talk about Brazil, and I'm going to focus more on the Argentina side, and we're going to, talk about a few examples here on Latin America, and how it has affected, production in our countries. So let me. Oh, sorry. There. Sorry about that. So I don't know. I cannot see your faces there, but I bet that everybody that has probably old as me or a little older will remember, what happened in Argentina in about 2001 when we have, the economic crash. And after that, we have, many government changes and policies, that affect production. Okay, so basically after 2001, when we have, big drop in production and in exports from the beef, sector, economies start, doing better. We did have an inflation we have an inflation going up, increase, and the fact of that, in order to control inflation and to keep, consumption for Argentinian consumers with beef production is culturally very important. There were several, government policies and regulations that have an effect on, production, exports, and production systems, in order to keep inflation and consumers and consumption up. We did that, and it had a lot of effect on other, it had a lot of side effects too that we have seen. Okay, so about in 2005, we start, previous that we had a 5 export tax, and about in 2005, we start having different, government policies from, minimum wage slaughter to, export taxes, export quotas, export restrictions. About between 2015 and 2019, there was another government coming in that took out those export taxes for a little while, okay, but mostly, there were no more export restrictions during that time. So we have several, I think here I mentioned about 25, government policies that we have. If you were a rancher or farmer at that point, every year, and every year you have 1 or 2 or 3 coming, new regulations that affect the way we produce and also create a lot of uncertainty on how we were doing things and where do we need to invest, or where the rancher need to invest. Okay, so we have seen all those, policies in terms of cow inventory. When we have in 2005, 2006, that cow inventory in 4 or 5 years after, the government policies, and because of the uncertainty that create and, the lack of profitability, the cow inventory was reduced by about 20% in 2009, 2010. In about 5 years, we were able to reduce about, 18, 20%. Okay. The beef cattle slaughter, of course, the first years, given, we start liquidating more, so we start producing more. And also because in 08 or 09, there was a big drought in Argentina specifically that increased also, how much cattle was liquidated at that time. It's not only that, but also, because of the lack of profits. What we have also seen is that on those beef productions, yes, we increased beef production in Argentina during that time, even if this was created mostly to keep those, prices down. Fed steer prices increased about 130%, but consumer prices in Argentina increased about almost 180% by 2012, and that was mostly because there was less production. Okay, all these policies changed the production systems in Argentina, and also decreased the production, which of course, sooner or later create more and more, prices going higher. When we look at exports and we compare this to Uruguay, about probably 2008, 2005, where we have, this big increase in exports, that's where we start, all those policies, government policies, we start having those government policies. Exports start decreasing until the lowest in 2012. In about 2015, we did have exports, we did have, no more exports restrictions. And we've seen, in several years, we went back to start, increasing and exporting again. And when we compare this to Uruguay, that did not have any of these restriction policies that we've seen in Argentina, Argentina missed a lot of years of, growing on exports and going on production. But most important when we see this, I believe is, when we see in 2009, we have beef productions going down, but at the same time, we have, total crops in other, mostly on soybeans and corn and wheat start going up. With that change in land use, some of that is because of these policies, some of that change in land use in the way of we were producing mostly on grass-fed, is really difficult to go back to the same production systems in Argentina. Okay, those changes on investments, it will, requires times, it requires, it requires investments, a lot of capital, but mostly it requires labor. And once after many years of not having the right, of probably, choosing, the know-how of the labor change because of these policies. So we used to have any of you who has done some, intensive grazing, you will know how, difficult it is to learn how to do that and to have the right people. It's both an art, that assist them sometimes. And these years of in Argentina of not working of all these policies, the side effect of these policies is that they change the way, farmers or ranchers are doing things in Argentina. Okay, they change the grazing systems, it changes the rotation of the land. And those things, it will take many years to go back. If you want to go back to production systems that are similar or that have similar rotations, and the land use is similar in that way. So, Yuri,
Sir.
I think I go within 5 minutes. Yuri, whenever you want to start your presentation.
Okay, here we go. You can go through the slides, right, Pancho? Well, no, you go back. My idea here is kind of give an overview what's going on in Brazil and how the geopolitical has been affect Brazil and Latin America overall. Just to give like some context, US is a historical partner. The multinational companies, the technology came to Brazil. They've set up the institutional framework. They help create like research agencies, fund universities, a lot of things that help propel the Brazilian agriculture came from the technology or the knowledge share from US. US is also a trade partner. But China, recently, since 2000, China has become more and more relevant to Brazil. To have an idea, in 2021, China imported 70% of the Brazilian soybeans, 43% of the Brazilian beef, 51% of Brazilian pork. So China is huge in buying from Brazil. That has been affected a lot. Meanwhile, Brazil needs to import fertilizer. And a lot of this fertilizer come from Russia, Belarus. So somehow Brazil needs these countries to keep producing because rely on these countries for fertilizers. In the same geopolitical context, we have Europe as a global regulatory platform. In general, some people blame Brazil for the deforestation of Amazon, and more regulatory frameworks always come from Europe as this one that's ongoing. Also, we have the following. We have the Mercosur and some kind of vision that Brazil should go through South-South more. That's all is the geopolitical context in Brazil. Please, Pancho, move for the next one. So in this graph, we show the Brazilian livestock heads, and I would like to point out two main bars, the orange and the yellow one. And both of this is because Mato Grosso and Pará are huge, not only huge producers, but they are states that border the Amazon region. So they're always concerned about these states. They have the Cerrado part, and they have also the Amazon biome as well. As you guys can see in the late years, we can see in the late years that the area has not increased in that much. The next one, Pancho. So this graph is just to show how relevant China has becoming in the last years, that gray bar. You can see that the amount of beef imported from China has been growing and growing. At the same time, the Russia has been decreasing. The next slide, Pancho. So people always blame the livestock, the cattle sector for a bunch of things, for emissions. But in this graph, we can see that indeed, in the last 10 years, the beef has been decreasing the area that are in Brazil. So we see less area allocated to cattle, but we see more production. So that's really relevant to see how Brazil is gaining efficiency, and we are not expanding the area for cattle in Brazil. The next one, Pancho. I have just a few minutes. But Brazil produces mainly in pasture land. So we have a huge pasture. So in this graph, you can see that they say that the Brazilian beef cattle accounts for over 15% of the emissions in the country. So that's a concern. But nobody put also the capture that the pasture has at the same time. But that's a concern as well. The next one, Pancho. So just to summarize and conclude about Brazil, Brazil is a relevant food supplier. Some people estimate that Brazil feeds over 1 billion people in the world and have a population of 200 million people. But there's a lot of things geopolitical saying about Amazon, and Brazil has been doing a lot. For example, the Brazilian Forest Code, the ABC plan, the crop livestock integration system, the production is not based on subsidies. Also, we can look at Brazil as a source for food safety and food security around the world, because in general, it's a democratic country with a peaceful relationships all over the world. So I believe my time is over, but I'm glad to elaborate more on these topics. You can go, Max.
Thank you very much, Mr. Khalil. We have one more panelist, and then we can discuss a little bit more about the ideas that you have been posing. So now I'm going to introduce our third panelist. Just Mr. Carlos Poveda is an economist, agricultural engineer, and entrepreneur with more than 40 years of experience in the agricultural sector of Latin America. Dr. Pomareda was the director of the policy program at IICA. Currently, he provides consultancy services to governments, companies, and international organizations while he manages his livestock farm in Costa Rica. Mr. Pomareda will discuss socio-economic and geopolitical drivers shaping livestock systems from the perspective of the private sector in Latin America and the Caribbean. Dr. Pomareda, you have 10 minutes, and I will let you know when you have 5 minutes left.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you for the invitation of this activity. Sharing the private sector views, it's a contribution of a very rich discussion. The fact that the meeting has invited discussions from all over the world and from different sectors makes it explicit that we are facing a very complex scenario. I'm not going to use the slides because only in 10 minutes there's a few comments that can be made. First point to stress is that the main perception we have from the private sector is that all these turbulence and interventions have impact on the markets. And as Yuri has just commented, it's all markets, fertilizers, grains, etc. So I think we have to be aware of the different ways markets are influenced and not just the markets for beef or dairy products. The second point is that it's hard to think of a discussion regarding policies if we are not immersed on the understanding of politics. So the two words, policies and politics, have a very different meaning, but very interrelated. And unfortunately, in Spanish, we say políticas y políticas, y a veces se piensa lo mismo. The third point is that a lot of the influence on markets, it's on products, but it's more in financial markets. And it's not just the cost of interest rates, but the main driver on financial markets is the easiness under which we can get credit for consumption, and the very hard way of getting credit for investment. It's not just a matter of interest rates, but the difficulty rate. And the third point to discuss on these interactions is the influence of power groups. We see them in the media, we see them in the financing of particular research interests, we see in the power of corporations and so on. So I think the interaction of all these factors invites us to a very serious discussion, because it's becoming difficult to move into the private sector under all these pressures. It's not only the big events what varies, but for example, the deceleration of China has implications, and it's anticipated that it will reach only 3% in 15 years more. For small countries, Yuri has mentioned in the case of Brazil, but Costa Rica has a high concentration of its beef exports on China, so the implications for small countries are also relevant. There are other problems like deceleration of the Latin American economies. that in the forthcoming years, it'll be close to 1.2 or 1.5% after it has been an average of 2.8 or 3%. So that is going to affect all countries differently. Another obvious focus on the country level is the situation of Argentina. The retention of 30% on Argentine beef exports is a big impact on the private sector. There are other issues related to politics. For example, the decline on Colombian exports to Venezuela that have, at a minimum, have declined 300% in 10 years of conflict and beginning to recoup now because of getting closer political positions. So what this is telling us is that the global aspects are very important, but the very specific country level relations are much more relevant for each specific country. What are the prospects? I see that we have to be, as Dr. Anderson say, optimistic. Yes, we have to be optimistic, but cautious. And I think that we have to make a good analysis of these conditions at the country level. The second point, and Alejandro stressed this on his presentation, about the very big differences in the country's economic, social, and political conditions. The other message we get relates to the prevention. I think Henning's explanation was clear on how the circle of interactions happen until we receive the impact. Well, but we have to be preventive. We have to anticipate events. And I think a lot of things can be done better if we prevent. Of course, the climate conditions are one of them, but the trends in innovations, the trends on political, economic decline, etc., are factors that we have to prevent. So I think that when it comes to making preventions, making an outlook of situations, we have a very different position of corporations. Large corporations and big traders, Cargill or many of the others, are very well prepared for these preventions, to support the analytical research. When we go to governments, unfortunately, the very short run under which politics is managed doesn't allow for long-term policies. And as a result, the governments are not prepared for this task. And now, in some group of producers, which we are, at least in which I am in Costa Rica, we are having a frequent discussions of these things, but it doesn't happen in many groups. It doesn't happen. So the position of governments and the weakness of our producer organizations, doesn't allow us to look at these issues towards the future. I feel like the contribution of GASP and as Shirley mentioned at the beginning, is a global responsibility. Yes, I accept it as a good global responsibility and it's necessary. However, FAO has at the country level an office in each country. So the discussion that we have at the global aspects and also in the 8 regional workshops has to be brought into the country. And it is not very costly, but we have the facilities of FAO to bring at the country level the discussions of these matters. So that's my brief comment on this. There are a lot of the issues that have been already mentioned, but I feel like we have to bring down the discussion for private sector better informated decisions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pomareda. We will now have a brief discussion with our colleague, Mr. Danilo Peso. So, Mr. Peso, would you like to provide a question for the panelists? And again, I want to remind everyone that is in the webinar that you can include your comments in the chat, or if you want to speak, you can raise your hand. But for now, Mr. Peso, what would you ask the panelists for this first section?
Thank you, Mariel. Thank you for the panelists. Very interested points have been brought for discussion. Before we receive some comments or questions from the public, I would start with one that anyone of the panelists could answer, but it's in the last decade, I would say, or a little more than that, the last 2 decades, we have seen progress in the developing world, moving from the traditional livestock systems to more sustainable livestock systems. At least that is what we feel when we talk to farmers, when we talk to the extension officer, when we talk to the decision makers in the ministries. According to you, what could be the most relevant driver of such change, and what can we do to increase that transition from traditional to more sustainable livestock production?
Perhaps any of the panelists, Mr. Yuri?
Well, if nobody gonna answer, I'm gonna go for it. Well, profits is a big driver. At least, let's say in Brazil, there's this competition for land. You see that decrease in the land for cattle because the soybeans has been like so profitable. So we need to increase the productivity of the cattle. If we increase the productivity of the cattle and decrease the age of the first calving, if we decrease the age that we're gonna slaughter the animals, we decrease the emissions as well. That's one example of like symbiosis, a good thing. For example, it's good economically and it's good for emissions as well. That's one example. If other people want to say more.
Thank you. Mr. Abello, do you want to?
Sure. So I think the first question, I have a question of that question is, how do we define sustainability first? Okay, and I think it's a little bit different on each place and even with producers. But the most important driver I've seen on changing production systems to be more sustainable or having that sustainable consciousness on farmers and ranchers in Argentina is mostly to do it in a way that first is profitable, but it's not profitable just for today, but it's also that view of in the long term how this gonna be profitable if I keep taking care of my soil, of my land, of of things that how this will be for the next generations. I think that view, at least mostly for probably because of how production systems and how the size of farms or lands in Argentina, you can have that view of thinking about how things should be in the future. And that's what, I believe, farmers and ranchers are looking at when they think about sustainability. It's not about profits of today, it's about how can I have this system that works in the future too, and also will work in next generations. And that's what is mostly driving the change. But the change is driven by the private sector. I do not believe is forced by any government or things like that. Is mostly driven by that. Probably sometimes scared of what might happen if they put some regulations, but so far it's been driven by the private sector.
So I'm gonna add a little bit about Brazil, because Brazil has a lot of institutional framework. For example, each farm needs to provide a geo reference for the government. So they kind of follow the farm from the satellites and see if you are deforestation or not, you're cutting your trees or not. And the law say that you should have at least 30% of your land intact. But so a lot of producers, to keep having the premium markets, say, well, we need to be sustainable. And they are seeing that being sustainable can bring profits as well. So they are adopting this technology, as Pancho said about the marketing mechanism.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cali. Mr. Acosta or Mr. Pomarel?
Thank you. I just wanted to add, I believe that one of the aspects is related to the decrease in margins. And I'm not sure if they are becoming more sustainable, but certainly more efficient. And as margins decrease, there are not many options. You become efficient or you are out of the business. So markets are becoming more competitive, and that is having an effect on margins. So those perhaps that are not being able to compete with smaller margins are moving out of the sector, giving room for those that are being more efficient in relative terms. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Acosta. Dr. Pomareda, would you like to comment on this?
I think the main contribution we can make to improve the conditions of small farmers is the level of education and the motivation to incorporate younger people. The population in the small farming in Latin America in particularly is getting old, and we need a renewal of generation, a lot of motivation, and change that negative perception of agriculture and cattle production. If we don't change the negative attitude, we are not going to create the necessary optimism and the willingness of more people to work and adopt the systems.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pomareda. For now, we will leave the comment section here. Again, anyone who wants to participate, you can include comments on the chat, and we will read out your questions to our panelists. We will now continue to our second section of the panel regarding solutions from a perspective of consumers and financing. For this, our first speaker is Jean-François Roquette. He's Director Research. He has Research Scientific at INRAE, the French National Research Institute for Agriculture, Food and Environment. His research interests mainly concern muscle biology as relevant to muscle growth and beef eating quality. He is actively involved in the activities of the European Federation of Animal Science and is the president of the French Association for Animal Production. Dr. Jean-François will be talking about insights on drivers of consumer perception about livestock production systems and products. Dr. Roquette, you have 10 minutes, and I will let you know when you have 5 minutes left.
Thanks for the invitation, and thanks for this kind introduction. So this study has been published recently, and first I would like to acknowledge my colleagues, Jingjing Liu, Gaia Shriki, Moise Combolo, Matteo Santinolo, Sergio Sanza from Brazil, Elise Oquette, Marie-Pierre Edier-Souris. So I've been working on beef production for many years. I'm very pleased to give this talk about consumer perceptions of meat production. So as you know, for centuries, livestock industry has been well perceived due to major services and benefits related to food production, because farm animals are able to convert inedible plants or waste into meat and milk. And these major services and benefits concerns economics in terms of jobs, markets. Livestock has also a social function in terms of gastronomy, social cohesion, education value, agritourism, and livestock interact with the environment to protect the landscape and to increase biodiversity. However, as you know, today, the impacts of livestock are more and more controversial, with more and more focused on the negative impacts of livestock in terms of animal welfare, environmental footprint, and human health. Therefore, reducing meat consumption or consuming meat substitutes are perceived as good ways to reduce the negative impacts of meat production from livestock. Therefore, we decided to design a survey. This survey was carried out by means of an international online questionnaire distributed worldwide. And this questionnaire was designed and organized into three sections. In the first sections, we had socio-demographic information of the respondents. And then we asked a first question: what are the most important criteria when you do your food shopping? And then participants were asked about their perception of the ethical and environmental challenges facing the livestock industry and meat production. So the questionnaire was designed initially in English and translated by native speakers into French, Chinese, and Portuguese, and distributed in France in the French, in China in Chinese, Brazil in Portuguese, and South Africa and Cameroon in English and French. So we received a total on 16,800 answers. So it means that we had a lot of answers and hopefully robust results. You can see on this line that the most important criteria during food shopping are eating quality or sensorial quality, I mean the taste, and also the price, the safety of the products, and at the fourth position, origin and traceability. There is a small gender effect. So men or males are more focused on origin and traceability and a little bit less on safety than women. So for men, safety is at the fourth positions instead of the third position. On this slide, you can see that we have analyzed the results according to age groups. And we had 3 age groups: young people between 18 and 30 years of age, middle-aged people in orange, and older people in blue, more than 51 years of age. So for older people, eating quality, sensorial quality, the price, and also ethical, nutritional, and environmental issues are slightly less important, but especially the price is less important. It's easy to interpret these results that old people are on average a little bit richer compared to young people. If you look at the results according to meat consumption level, you can see that according to the 4 groups we had, daily and regularly meat eaters or rarely or never meat eaters, you can see that for people who don't eat meat so much, ethical, nutritional, and environmental issues are very important, especially for people who never eat meat in green. And on the opposite, for people who eat meat a lot, daily or regularly, eating quality and safety, origin, and traceability are important and less important for people who eat meat rarely or never. There is also a strong country effect. In all countries, eating and sensorial qualities and the price are very important. However, they are slightly more important in Brazil and then in South Africa and France. And for the price, South Africa, Brazil, and Cameroon are the countries which focus the most on price. Regarding safety, it's a criterion which is very important in Brazil and China. Brazil, South Africa, and China focused quite a lot on the nutritional value of food. Ethical and origin traceability issues are very important in France, whereas French respondents and Brazilians focused a little bit more on labels. For France and South Africa, environmental issues are quite important. And in South Africa and Cameroon, energy intake provided by food and appearance of food products are quite important. We ask also the following questions to respondents. How many would you like to eat meat substitutes, or do you eat meat substitutes? And on average, 45% of them already do eat meat substitutes. This proportion is slightly higher for women compared to men. It's higher for young people compared to middle age and old people. It's much higher for respondents who eat rarely or never meat. It's quite high in China and quite low in France. And in Brazil, it's quite low as well. If we ask another questions, would you like to eat culture meat as a meat substitute? I would like first to remind you what culture meat is. Culture meat is made from the culture of muscle cells to produce a high amount of muscle fibers. And on average, 40% of consumers would like to accept culture meat as a viable alternative. Again, this proportion is higher for women, higher for young people, higher for respondents who don't eat meat or who eat meat rarely. It's quite high in China and very low in France, but in contrast to the previous results, is quite high in Brazil. So in conclusion, we made a typology of respondents according to the level of meat substitute they eat. And we discriminated two groups: respondents who don't eat meat substitutes and respondents who eat meat substitutes. In the first group, you can see regular meat eaters or daily meat eaters. And in the second group, you can see rarely meat eaters or people who never eat meat. For meat eaters or people who don't eat meat substitutes, eating quality, origin, traceability are quite important. And for people who don't eat meat but eat meat substitutes, ethical and nutritional environmental issues are quite important. So respondents who are not meat eaters tend to eat meat substitutes, and they are mainly motivated by ethical, environmental, and nutritional issues. And this is the opposite for meat eaters who don't eat meat substitutes, who are mainly motivated by sensorial quality, origin, and traceability. But which is very interesting is that price, safety, appearance, and the presence of a label are common values, so common drivers of meat consumption or consumption of meat substitutes. On this slide, you can see a summary of 24 papers which have been published in a special issue of Meat Science. So again, the safety, the price, and the eating quality are very important for all consumers. They are drivers of meat consumptions. However, Chinese consumers put more focus on safety and the price. Consumers from Africa more focused on the price and social identity of meat consumption. And consumers from Spain and South Africa put more focused on the pleasure of eating meat and the gastronomy, the culture, the traditions, and so on. Young, highly educated, and rich consumers in Western countries are highly motivated by safety, nutritional value, environmental, and ethical issues. And these are motives to consume meat substitutes. So I would like to thank you to have listened to me. On this slide, you can see the title of the special issue of Meat Science, in which our paper, Consumer Perception of the Challenges Facing Livestock Production and Meat Consumption, has been published. I would like to mention this special issue of Animal Frontiers about the societal role of meat. And this is the basis of the Dublin Declaration in favor of a fair science about the societal role of livestock. And you have here the link to this Dublin Declaration. And if you agree with it, you are welcome to sign it. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hoquet. And thank you very much for presenting these very interesting results from your paper. I will now give the floor to our final speaker, Mr. Felipe Peguero. Dr. Peguero is an economist with a strong background in finance, agribusiness, food processing, and agronomy. At CATIE, he works as a professor and specialist in agricultural economics and climate finance, where he coordinates the climate financing component of several projects across Latin America. Dr. Peguero will talk about climate finance as a driver of change for the livestock sector based on CATIE's experience. Dr. Peguero, you now have 10 minutes, and I will let you know when you have 5 minutes left.
Thank you for the opportunity. So in this presentation, I will be talking about climate finance and how that relates to the path toward decarbonization and adaptation, especially here in our region, in the area that we work at CATIE. As you all may know, climate finance is everything related to the mobilization of resources to support actions for mitigation and adaptations. And really, I think this is an opportunity to shift livestock system to a more sustainable pathway. But we have to remember, going back to the presentation that was done, Dr. Henning, that in reality, climate finance is a response, it's a consequence of the environmental drivers, right? As livestock is associated with emissions, climate change, then in response to those environmental effects, then climate finance is a alternative. But at the same time, looking at the supply side of the economy, so it works as an economic driver, shaping the supply of livestock systems. In reality, what happened is the climate finance increase help us to improve the adoption rate of technology and practice for adaptation and mitigation. With that context, then I want to also emphasize that traditionally, we have the traditional banking system. It has been very important as a driver for livestock systems, specifically because it has helped us to invest in new technologies and the livestock sector. But as you know, all that was associated with higher mitigation with the previous technology of the livestock sector. So what we think is that giving the big amount of loans given every year, so the traditional financing, the traditional banking system represent a big opportunity for sustainable transformation. But for that to happen, we need that transformation in the banking system as well. As you can see in this graph, in average, in Latin America, the banking industries are deploying about $35 billion per year to the agriculture sector. And most of that financing go for the traditional food system. So, and this is very important because there is very little knowledge on how much each dollar that we place in the banking system contribute to greenhouse gases emission. And that is important for research to be done in the area. So I just want, with this slide, I want to highlight two samples of traditional lending for cattle farms, especially in Honduras and the Dominican Republic. Most of the lending, most of the funds that go into financing the sector, especially the cattle ranching, come from public banks. That means there is an opportunity to work with those type of institutions to help them transform their portfolio of loans. And most of those loans are usually special programs from different the Minister of Agriculture, trying to support the livestock sector. But when we go deeper and we analyze the portfolio of those loans, we see that most of those loans are usually used to purchase animal. Very low proportion of all the loans goes into improving the efficiency of the livestock system. In consequence, and giving a lot of other different factors, there is also a high default rate. A big proportion of the loan portfolio are in risk of default. And that is especially troublesome because if we want to encourage the private sector to continue financing the sector, we have to address the risk that is implicit in the livestock sector. So at CATI, we have several projects using climate finance to shape the livestock sector. For example, we are using climate finance to enable conditions and improve capacity building across the value chain of the cattle system in a way that the extension agencies, we can promote a package of technology that help us to improve productivity, emission, profitability, reduce emission, and increase carbon sequestration, and overall help us to have a emission intensity, a product with low emission intensity. So, but as you know, we need financing to allow that process to happen. And for that, we are also developing climate finance instruments with the banking industry in order to catalyze the adoption, and also helping the banking industry in the countries of intervention to transform their portfolio toward more sustainable. And also, it is important to habilitate climate finance to enable conditions at the governance level and creating institutional alignment. As you know, climate finance, therefore, has a big potential for mitigation, for the transformation of our livestock systems. So reading this recent article from the World Bank, it says that if we adopt the right policies, such as penalizing carbon emission, and if we reward carbon sequestration, we could allow the sector to have a potential to reduce about 90% of their net emissions. This is a quite good number that puts us within the planetary boundaries. And also, when we go and see the need for climate finance in Latin America to meet the target, the mitigation target, according to the estimation, we need about 40 billion per year. And if you remember from our previous slide, the total banking sector is providing about 35 billion per year. So there is an opportunity there. But when we analyze how much of the that climate finance is going into the livestock sector, it's less than 1%. And when we try to identify how that climate finance is going to poultry, to chicken, to livestock, that information is not well mapped. So there is opportunity to do research and contribute in that way. So at CATI, when we are trying to encourage farmers to adopt a technological package, right? So what we always try to do is, because of our region, we need to customize those technological package, because each farm is different and it depends on the country, the region, the conditions. And in our project related to climate finance, we depend basically on a building capacity module component where with extension agents, we diagnose the farm, we help train the farmers, select the innovation to create that change path, therefore showing the farmer through a business case how those possible intervention can become more profitable, and in that way helping farmers to access to market and finance their investment and implement them, and then monitor, which is very important. But this changes from country to country and from region to region, and that is our experience that we have in CATI. Also, we think that it's important for us to scale up those practices at the national level, right? To scale up this, it's very important to support the transformation of the banking system, especially because most of the project lasts only 3, 4, 5 years. And it's important to allow the banking system to continue with a range of stakeholders. For example, in this graph, what we see is 2 financial instruments, a concessional loans, which let's say provide loan to 500 farmers, and a risk cover guarantee that allows us to mobilize public and private loans through the scaling up mechanism. And in that way, we can reach, let's say, 1,000 more farmers, giving the mobilization opportunity. So the idea with this diagram is that most of the projects usually concentrate giving extension to producers and actors in the value chain. But it's important also in the knowledge management platform of projects to include education to credit officials in a way that we can train staff from the banking industry in a way they can learn from that experience, can relate how emission relate to, how credits relate to emission reduction, and therefore take that experience to help transform the other portfolio of loans they have in their banks. So when we are analyzing the different mechanism instrument that we can use, everything depends on a barrier analysis that changes from country to country, from region to region, even within a sector, in a specific, let's say, provinces, those barrier changes. And what I want to highlight here is that once we finalize selecting a financial instrument, it's important to establish risk mitigation strategies. How we guarantee that those financial mechanisms will be successful in the future, right? That depends on, for example, in technical assistance, record keeping, monitoring, triangulations within producer, industry, banking. So each risk mitigation depends on the sector where we are speaking, on the country. And it is important to have that because when we are modeling the financial instrument, how many farmers we finance in the long run depends on those risk mitigation strategies. So for example, in this instrument we have for one of our countries of intervention, we want to use concessional loans to kickstart climate finance. And during the project, we want to finance those producers that are in green, but with the risk mitigation strategy, with the exit strategy of the project, then we want the banking industry and the extension agencies to continue supporting farmers in order to continue generating mitigation and adaptation through time through this financial instrument. The same thing applies for other instruments, which is called the risk cover guarantee, which objective is to mobilize public and private loans and help farmers to ease the access to credit, as was mentioning Carlos Pomareda before. So in here, we need that instrument to help farmers access credit, but at the same time, we want those institutions to allocate loans to farmers while the project is in place and continue doing it after the project finishes. So with those two instruments are only two examples of the different instruments we can use for climate finance, but there is more. And with that, I'm gonna close my presentation and say thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Felipe, for your presentation. It was quite interesting indeed. We will be able to further comment on this on the next section of question and answers. We have already a couple of questions on the chat, and we also have someone who wants to take the floor to ask a question. Let me remind everyone that if you would like to make a question, either in English or in Spanish, you can feel free to do so. For now, what I will do is give the the floor to Mr. Danilo Peso, who will start this section of the Q&A with a question for the panelists. Mr. Peso.
Thank you, Mariel. I think we have two completely different topics in this section, you know. Then first, I would like to refer to Dr. Hoquet's presentation. I think it is a very interesting study on consumers' perceptions about this culture meat and all this type of substitutes of meat. And an interesting thing is the differences between or among countries, the consumers of the different countries. Now, a question I would have is that one of the reasons for looking for these new options to replace meat is among others, is the footprint, the environmental footprint of beef production. I wonder if there is data, at least projections, indicating what will be the effect on emissions when a large number of consumers replace the consumption of traditional beef or pork or poultry meat, you know. And otherwise, basically, most of this will continue being a good option for vegans and vegetarians.
There are not so many works or so many studies about the emissions of culture meat. Maybe more than 10 years ago, there was a publication by the University of Oxford, which said that culture meat would be very good in terms of emissions, with less emissions compared to normal meat or conventional meat. But thereafter, there were other papers with different results. And these new papers claims that the first estimation was not so good, and the environmental impact of culture meat was underestimated. In addition to that, there is a difference between CO2, mainly produced by culture meat, and methane produced by livestock. And depending on the calculation and depending on the future, short-term, long-term future, you may have opposite conclusions regarding the potential benefits of culture meat. On the long term, culture meat would have no benefits in terms of emissions. It also depends how you make the calculations. If you compare direct emissions with total emissions of beef, total emissions being direct plus indirect emissions. And there is a recent paper claiming that if you count indirect emissions in addition to direct ones, the emissions of culture meat would be quite very high. So the claims by private companies that culture meat would be good for the environment is not shared by academic scientists or scientists working in universities or public research institutes, and this needs more work, for sure.
You know, if you don't mind, if I add a comment or a question, you know, on the cell culture meat, I think one of the other interesting things is as consumers, if consumers learn more about it, that this is manufactured in a lab, in a manufacturing facility, but questions about how you a food safety thing, just basics, and how do you keep what is essentially not really a fermentation process, but I've got these cells and I'm going to feed it a medium for them to grow. How do you keep that clean? I'm going to use the word clean in terms of, are you using antibiotics? What are you using to sterilize all the equipment with? There's a cleanliness thing here in terms of keeping the wrong thing from growing and growing the right thing, if you will. And we see that in other kinds of things, whether it's, making beer or whatever it is, you have the same issues of sanitation and things like that. I wonder if that doesn't change some consumers' perceptions if they learn more about it and what goes on that label and things like that. I think that's really an interesting kind of area for work.
I completely agree. And depending on what you explain to consumers, you will have different perceptions. And so far, private companies explain that kosher meat is absolutely clean, but some scientists from university or public research organizations try to explain that it's not so simple. In some papers, private companies do recognize that they still use antibiotics, probably not a lot, but they still use antibiotics. And there are many questions related to safety. And recently there was an expertise managed by FAO. And the conclusion was that there were maybe 50 or 53 questions with no answer so far about safety. So it's not clear if kosher meat is very clean.
Thank you very much, Mr. Anderson, Mr. Huquet. We have a question from our public at the moment. I'm going to read out the question on voluntary carbon markets. The question is it more accessible for small and medium livestock producers organizations? Perhaps this is in reference to Mr. Peguero's presentation.
Sure. Maybe Alejandro Acosta can help me too as well, because he talked about carbon market. I think always the problem with small livestock farmers is how related to the carbon market is how do you measure their carbon credit, so the transaction cost of having that measure on small farmers is quite high. So I'm wondering, maybe if we have like scheme in which so you don't need those type of measurement and you have like a specific, let's say a cover crop, for example, could be easy to help small farmers to access to voluntary carbon market. But I still have to do more research on that question. But maybe my colleagues here can help me out, especially Alejandro. In US, there is there is a lot of experience on voluntary carbon market as well. So maybe Yuri and David Anderson can help out.
Well, for the small, medium producers, it's hard to prove they're seeking the carbon. That's the big deal. There's a lot of research that has been doing, how many carbon are you sequestrating and for how long can you keep on the soil? That's the big question. That's still kind of debatable. There's a lot of research on that, and there's some cost associated with that. So for the small and medium producers, could be a thing in the future, but it's not that easy as far as I see, close to me, let's say.
And I think that's the issue for large farmers too, or large farms, is measurement. And how do you show that you increase that carbon? Drought affects how much you sequester. And so it's a longer term thing rather than a short term thing. But, I think small producers, at least here, can participate. I think one of the things some folks have discovered at least in range livestock production is that the amount of money that we're talking about really is very small. And there's a lot of variability in this measurement idea. And, how is this really going to turn out to be something viable? I think it's kind of it's a little bit of an open question still.
One more thing if you let me, economies of scales matter. And with that, what I say is you have costs, and basically these are mostly, sometimes are very long contracts. They need to be discussed with lawyers in most cases. And if there is, if you're doing it on 50,000 acres on rangeland, even if the money per acre is not that much, you might have the economies of scale to pay for or look with a lawyer and discuss it and have more information on what you're signing. That a small 50 acre, 100 acre, rancher with rangeland, it will be enough for him to pay all the expenses that they have.
Thank you. We have another question from a participant. It's going to be a live question. Mr. Faguri Said, just to make sure, if you want to take the floor, you just let us know and you will open your microphone. Just in consideration of time, if you can ask your question in about 30 seconds, let us know if you would still like to participate. Let's see, in the meantime, we have from before another question in reference to the example Mr. Yuri mentioned in Brazil about the law, the GPS reference from each farm, forestry code, and that there is an issue rather with the enforcement of law, of those elements of the law, rather than the existence of some policy. So perhaps if you could comment on that, on the existence of a rule rather than the actual enforcement of those.
Well, I cannot deny enforce the law is a thing I believe everywhere. For sure, the law needs to be enforced. But also it's worth noting that Brazil is a huge country. And for example, one guy in the south of Brazil is like 3,000 kilometers from Amazon. When something happened for the entire country. So traceability is an issue. Also, another thing is the discussion about the profitability and the business of livestock. Brazil has 2.5 million establishments producing livestock. Every municipality in Brazil, every city has cattle in it. And also there's a lot of small producers because cattle allows the people to manage. For example, this year is not good, they're gonna sell in next year, or I can milk my cows. There's a lot of small producers that relies on cattle for survivorship. And a lot of times we don't talk about these people, we talk about the big ones. But anyway, it's an issue, enforce the law, it's an issue, the deforestation, and we need to keep an eye on it. Also, there's the thing related to prospect theory. For example, the people are more concerned in the rate of change than the overall thing. And they have the anchoring effect as well. I'm telling this because, for example, Amazon is there. There's a lot of preservation. There's a lot of forest over there. And people only focus on the deforestation that they need to be worried about. But nobody say, hey, there's a lot of effort to keep the forest. There is a lot of effort to make the production sustainable. So there's the two sides of the coin. There's for sure, there's the people that are doing wrong things, but there's a lot of people trying to do the good things. That's only my point.
Thank you very much, Mr. Yuri. Perhaps, Mr. Peso, do you have an additional question for speakers?
Regarding the the financing aspects, I think it goes to Felipe Peguero. Reading the literature and also after watching the presentation of Felipe, it is clear that the access of the livestock sector to climate finance is marginal. No, maybe you could elaborate a little more. What are the reasons for that limited access, and what can be done to overcome that problem?
Sure. Yeah, when we are doing the barrier analysis to really establish those climate finance instruments, usually there is a big list of potential barriers, but always you have the issue of farmers that do not have the financial educations in order to understand how to better manage their risk. And also, there is also, when you're talking to the banking industry, in general, there is a high risk assigned to the agriculture sector. And within the agriculture sector, the livestock sector. Why? Because it's more profitable for the banking industry to provide loans on the consumers rather than agriculture, because there is a lot of technical risks like drought, like errors on productions and so on, right? So there is two sides of the coin. The factors related to the producers, in which they have low educations related to how to manage better their loans, and for that reason you have those high level of default risk on the portfolio of livestock, for example, right? Because they forget when to pay the loan, they forget, and also there is other concern as well, because we found in a study that we did in the Dominican Republic, when we analyzed like 20,000 farmers, one of the main drivers as well was the probability of the farmers having a drought. So that is another concern as well, right? So most of the time, the farmers take the loan, but they don't take the appropriate measures in order to increase their resilience toward drought, right? And that is a major concern. So one thing that we were watching let's say in Honduras and the Dominican Republic, was that some of the programs, special programs, they are providing the loans, but they are not following up. Let's say the extension agency is not following up the loans, is not providing technical assistance. And that is an opportunity that is lost, because the Minister of Agriculture, through the national banks, is providing the loan. And then you have the extension agency providing extension to another farmers. So there is no link. So that also contributes to that default risk. And yes, and mainly those are the main factors, but there is much more, right, that we can discuss in another occasion.
Thank you, Felipe. Perhaps another one of the panelists would like to comment on this from your experiences. Okay, and we have also another question. It goes back to the culture meet, and the comment is in regards to if the demand is of the middle and upper class, if you have been able to identify that the demand actually for culture meat comes from a specific demographic. Mr. Hoket?
I don't think there is a huge demand. There is a proposal made by investors and private companies. They want to propose new sources of proteins, which is called culture meat. But so far, culture meat is not well known by consumers, because this product is not commercialized yet, except in Singapore and the USA, and very recently. So culture meat is not really available in the market. So consumers don't know very well what it is. They don't have a strong demand for that. They have, of course, a demand for meat substitutes, but not specifically for culture meat. And there is a huge effort from private companies which work on culture meat to explain what it is, what are the potential benefits, and so on. And of course, the middle and high social classes, higher educated people or young people are more sensitive to these arguments because they would like to protect the environment and so on. And so it's not a demand, but it's a more attention to the arguments and the claims provided by private companies, by middle and upper social classes and young people.
Thank you, Mr. Hoquet. Yes, because indeed, well, if we're considering price and sensory quality as the main drivers in food purchases, meat alternatives regarding sensory or how similar it is or tastes or looks like would be an interesting factor in when the demand starts growing or if it starts growing for culture meat. Let's see, I guess, let me see if we have any other questions from the participants. If you want, you can raise your hand or put it in the chat. If there are no more questions from the chat, I will give the floor to Mr. Peso just for some concluding words, some concluding observations for this part of the discussion.
Thank you, Mariel. I think the session today has been very, very interesting with different points of view on these topics of the drivers for change through this transition from the traditional to the more sustainable system. Sorry, I think there was a problem with the camera, but then we really appreciate the participation of the keynote speaker, of the discussants or the panelists, and the difference in the 3 sessions that we have today, and for all who joined us in this webinar and the previous 2 webinars that we had last week. Thank you very much to all. I guess, I think there are very interesting contributions that will be has been gathered and will be part of a report that Katia will submit to GASU before the meeting to be held in Chiang Mai, Thailand. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Peso. And as we wrap up today's session, we'll again recall that the main learnings and takeaway messages will feed the discussion of the 8th GASL regional consultation that will take place around the world in the next 6 months, the 6 weeks, I'm sorry, from 8 September, 17th October, in preparation, as Mr. Peso said, for the 13th GASL Global Meeting in Chiang Mai, Thailand, from the 30th of October to the 3rd of November. The regional consultations will address the effect of drivers of change on livestock systems, the best solutions to deal with drivers' pressures, and how multi-stakeholder action can collaborate with the implementation of solutions to keep sustainability and enhance resilience of livestock systems. A group of representatives of each region will bring their main messages to the global discussions in Chiang Mai, Thailand. The regional consultations will both be virtual and a hybrid, and I will show you the schedule of these consultations so you can see how these are distributed across regions and how the dates are. Here you can see these are the regional consultations that will be carried out in the different areas of the world. So you can see the dates, the times that this will be taking place. There is still a pending one for North America, but for the rest, these are the dates that are available. Also, I would like to remind everyone that all of these webinars are still available in Katia's and GASL's Facebook and YouTube pages. So you can watch this one again, and you can also watch the last 2 webinars that we had. All of the presentations and informations will also be part of a repository that will be available at the 13th GASL meeting, and all of the information will have been recopilated for them. As also, I want to recall again, as we continue celebrating the 50th anniversary of Katia, the important work and the commitments that the institution has on the successful implementation of projects in sustainable agriculture. Again, thank you all for your participation, for the panelists, and for the people who joined us live today. And indeed, your contributions make these discussions very rich and meaningful. And thank you very much for everyone who joined. Everything is in the chat if you want to consult the links. And again, thank you very much, and I hope you have a good rest of the day. Thank you.